Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second CME Palooza session of the day. I am Derek Warnick, one of the co-producers for CME Palooza Spring. We are sort of dealing with one technical issue on one of our speakers, but we're going to move forward with what we have, and we will deal with that as she comes back. So let me go with my intro slides here. Okay, so our second session of the day is Outcome Standardization Project 1 year later, sort of a continuation of a previous program we've had. Our panelists today are Brian McGowan, who is Chief Learning Officer for Archimedics, Sue McGinnis, who just popped on. And Sue, can you hear us?
I can.
You can. I'm going to do one quick
test. To break us.
Brian, say something. Let's see if Sue can hear you.
Sue, can you hear me?
I can.
Yay!
I have to say, we just had the craziest thing where, of course, we're a half hour on, everything's fine. Then about 5 minutes ago, for some reason, Sue couldn't hear Brian. I could hear everybody else. It was crazy, but we're good to go. That's why we love CME Palooza, because we can go with the flow. Okay, so Sue McGinnis, Senior Medical Med Ed Grants Manager for AstraZeneca, and Wendy Terrell, Vice President for CME Outcomes and Analytics at Platform Q Health. As always, everyone's favorite part of the presentations, the reading of the sponsors. Yes, we will read every sponsor. Yes, we'll read them every time. Our gold sponsor, a big thank you to Academic CME. Our silver sponsors, ASIM, Creative Educational Concepts, and Prova Education. And our bronze sponsors, Answers in CME, ACHL, Catalyst Medical Education, Catamount Medical Education, Clinical Care Option, CMEology, Global Academy for Medical Education, Global Education Group, Helio Education Lab, Integritas Communications. I think Scott makes these smaller every time, though I have to squint when I look at them. Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, Primary Care Network, PVI, Red Med Ed, Army Eye, Thistle Editorial, and Vindico Medical Education. As always, 3 ways that you can ask us questions. You can use the ASIM text line, which is 267-6660-CME. You click on the Google Slides link found on the live page. It should be right above the video that you are watching. There's a link. I am Derek, so make sure you click on the link besides me. Unlike Scott, I don't put the link in my slide, because what's the point? You can't click on it, Scott. You can't click on it. Tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. I'll be monitoring all 3 of those different avenues, so feel free to use any one that you want. And lastly, our speaker disclosure side, all opinions, discussions, and/or conclusions expressed are our own and do not represent an endorsement by or a position of our employer, its parent company, or affiliates. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Brian. Brian, take it away.
Derek, thank you for leaving us a little bit of time in our session today.
Just a little.
Yeah.
And everyone can just confirm that you can see my screen? Yes. And Sue, can you confirm that you can see my screen too?
Yes, and I can hear you.
Awesome.
We're off and running.
All right, so this is officially the culmination of nearly a year's worth of efforts. So what we'd like to do today between Sue, Wendy, and I is walk through, for those who are unfamiliar, a brief review of the background and the need for the Outcome Standardization Project. We will then, fingers crossed, we will officially present and release the Outcomes NCE website and explain a little bit about the how the Outcome Standardization Project could be used and how to access the glossary and its contents. And then we've identified over the last year, there's a few terms and definitions that have probably garnered a little bit more interest in the community. So just as a brief example of the way the glossary is structured, we're going to review a few of those. And then we've been fortunate in all of these conversations and planning discussions over the last year to begin to understand how the OSP, the glossary, is being used. And so this should take us through the session today. Each one of us has a role to play in the presentation. But when I say each of us has a role to play, that means you do as well. For many folks who are participating today, this may be the first time seeing the first version of the glossary. And so we're going to pause a few different times within the sessions, and using the various communication channels that Derek alluded to, we're hoping that you can begin sharing your either questions you have, thoughts you have, and we can answer those as we go through. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. McGinnis.
Yay. Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you to Derek and CME Palooza and everyone for joining us today. So basically, at the AIS last year, this is when the whole OSP concept really came to happen, right? That's the kickoff. So basically, at that meeting, Anthea Mandarakis was the chairperson, and as part of the planning committee, she had two different presentations in the realm of metrics and outcomes on the agenda. The first one was given by Greg Salinas, and the title was Standardization of Outcomes, Lessons Learned from Attempts to Aggregate. And then that was followed up a few hours later by, Karen Ruiz Cortez, who spoke about the Tower of Babel. I think she was joined by Anne-Marie Diamateo. So the Tower of Babel, enough already. Can we please speak the same language? So basically, I believe Greg's presentation set such a great framework and covered a lot about what Karen and Anne-Marie were going to talk about. So then they quickly revised their presentation to be a little bit more interactive and to really be a call for action. And so at the end of Karen and Anne-Marie's section, someone who may or may not want to announce his name stood up and said, "I'm willing to lead this." Brian, that's your cue.
I've made worse decisions in my life.
Yes,
I
you have.
also, Stu, just to give credit, so Mike Riley was also part of that presentation with Karen and Anne-Marie. It was really the Regeneron team trying to immediately come to grips with the foundation that Greg had just set out.
Yes. And so for me, I was in the audience and I thought this is fantastic because honestly, I've been in the industry for a few years and I'm kind of tired of this topic. So when Brian stood up, I thought, yes, this is going to happen because I had worked with Brian in a few roles back at Cephalon. So at the end of that meeting, right, Brian said, "I'm going to lead this. I'm going to collect some people, bring some people together, and we're going to put together a plan." So what you're seeing right now is the OSP steering committee. This is a group of, they're very highly educated, committed, dedicated to outcomes. So you can see everyone on the screen. And so this presentation is actually being delivered on the benefit or the because of all the knowledge of this team. So next slide. So of course, we had to come up with a problem statement. So as a steering team, what are we trying to solve? So I'm going to pause for a second so you can read the words on the slide, and then I'll read them with you. So because the community lacks a standardization outcomes language and a set of standardized approaches to measuring impact, we cannot effectively compare and aggregate outcomes, data, and insights, and we struggle to effectively understand and communicate the value of CE. So the steering committee got all behind this problem statement, and we think that this really captures what we're trying to solve for with this outcome standardization project. Now, what I will say is if you do have any comments on that problem statement, if you agree, don't disagree, want to add something to it, please enter a comment or send a text because we'd love to hear it, or you can wait until the end and we'll definitely love to hear your comments. Sorry, Derek. So the next slide. So the beauty of this problem statement is that it can be looked through the lenses of different stakeholders in our community, the providers, the supporters, and the researchers. So from the provider side of these, obviously everyone wants to simplify outcomes analysis and reporting. It's always such a heavy lift and it's a burden and it's time consuming and it's something that we haven't quite figured out. And Greg Salinas did a wonderful job of outlining that in the CME Palooza in the fall. From the supporter side, which would be my side, simplifying the how do I aggregate all the outcomes so that I can demonstrate the impact that the education has had and really demonstrate the value proposition of MIGO. And then from the standpoint of researchers, so more of where Brian and Wendy perhaps are coming from would be because we need this in order to establish that branch of educational science, something that we can build off. And then obviously we want to accelerate best practices and credibility. So what is very important to us is to ensure that everyone knows exactly what we're doing, because we're trying to do this. We're a working group. We're committed to this, but we're trying to do it for everyone, and we want everyone's input, and we want everyone to know exactly where we are. And so the first thing would be in 2018, there was an Almanac article. So the title was the 2018 CE Outcome Standardization Project, Just the Beginning. And then also there was the 2018 CME Palooza session, Trust the Process, and the terms we used to describe it, a standardized outcomes taxonomy. So if you have any questions, want to know a little bit more about the background, go to these two references. So for me, I always come back to this because I think the steering committee put together this amazing process, very thoughtful about it. And they also put together a solid timeline, and we're keeping to that timeline. And in pharma, timelines are always changing, projects are always changing. And I feel like we're never quite according to timeline. So this is like the favorite message that I love to share about what we've been able to do. So the steering committee set out with 6 different phases, and I'm happy to report we're at phase 5. So phase 1 started with the steering team planning, and that happened between June and September 2018. So right after the AIS, this group got to work. Phase 2, there was one-to-one interviews, and that happened between September and October of 2018. And that was really important because as a steering committee in phase 1, we came up with a whole list, 80 some terms. And then these interviews were to talk about like basically the top 24 that we thought we should focus on in this first round. And then in phase 3, we went to focus groups, right? Because we had this list, we had 24 terms. Brian will show you how we were capturing our definition of those terms. And we want to run those by the focus groups. And then we had the call for comments, and that was in December 2018, January 2019. And that was really important because this is our unveiling to our community, and we welcomed all feedback. Right now, phase 5, we are actually at the launch and advocacy. We're kicking it off. Brian will be in a few seconds. And then later what we'll move to is round 2. So we'll build off the current glossary, and we'll start to add other terms. So anyway, so this is a beautiful timeline, and I'm very proud of it. And I also want to thank everyone that was involved in the one-on-one interviews, the focus groups, as well as the call for comments. Really appreciate your time and effort and your commitment to seeing this vision with us. To you, Brian.
Thank you, Sue. And I think Sue's made the point pretty well, but this is a fully volunteer effort. And since May of last year, there have been hundreds and hundreds of hours spent to try to get this right. And since it's a volunteer effort, the ideas of transparency and rigor that Sue referred to were maybe in our first steering team call that we set that as how we want to approach this. And so while these 5 phases, they span 9 or 10 months, I'm not sure it can possibly reflect the amount of time. So for each interview, those interviews are recorded, and every member of the steering team went through the interviews, and then we would regroup several times and talk about what we learned from the interviews. And we'd update the glossary, and we'd move into the focus groups. They were all recorded. Almost 24 individuals participated in the focus groups from different organizations in different sub-member groups within the community. And then we went through those, and we listened to the recording, and we re-listened to the recordings, and we looked for areas of weakness. And we fought a lot about what belongs. And in many cases, I can say this with no hesitation whatsoever, there was no pride by any member of the steering team. And in each of the interviews and the focus groups, while someone may have come with this idea that they knew exactly how to do this thing or that thing, or they knew exactly what one term meant, it was almost always immediately confronted with someone else saying, well, I've been doing it a different way for 15 years. So what you're describing is interesting to me, but it's not my approach. And what we quickly learned is that there really isn't, there clearly was nobody who had all of this figured out. And in many cases, there was conflict around things that were so what people I think generally thought were so mundane and well understood. And there wasn't just conflict between people who are kind of new to it or a year or two away or in kind of small shops who maybe don't have the exposure. We're talking the leaders of providers and the leaders of full supporter med ed groups fundamentally disagreeing on the value of one term or one measurement. And so what you might realize as we go through and we introduce the first glossary is in many ways, it is very foundational. We've joked now for a better part of 6 months that we spent the first 2 months just trying to figure out what to call a learner or a participant. 2 months to try to figure out Moore's level 1, understanding that there was no consensus. Fundamentally, I've been told by folks in their initial comments and their initial reaction to the glossary that I've never, a supporter would say, I've never questioned when someone said they had 5,000 learners and 50 credit requesters. I never questioned what they meant by a learner. It's clearly someone who completed an activity. And in one sentence, they were misdefining 3 different terms, but they did it with confidence. And so when I say there was no pride, there were so many occasions where someone made an initial statement because they had been doing it that way for years with confidence and with clarity, only to realize that someone who was equally as experienced and with the track record and pedigree said that isn't the right way to go about it. So what we ask for the community is just to keep in mind that this volunteer steering team with no organizational support, aside from each of our organizations kind of freeing us up a little bit to do this work, no organizational support, no project management support, and no budget, is currently intending to present what we think to be the consensus of the broader community, not just the steering team, but the nearly 50 individuals who, through the interviews, focus groups, and call for comments, have weighed in and provided their perspective through either that lens of the provider, the lens of the supporter, or the lens of the research scientist. So we're not claiming that everything in here is perfect. We're not claiming that we've solved the problem. And maybe most importantly, we're not claiming that every single person in the community must follow everything that's in the initial 24, 25 terms of the glossary. What we're simply suggesting is that it's in the community's best interest that if you use these terms or you intend these definitions, that you refer to this glossary as a means of standardizing that taxonomy. And this should make sense in a split second. So I'd like to introduce everybody to outcomesnce.org. You can go there right now. Understanding the audience that CME Palooza generates could easily crash this website that I've built over the last 4 months.
Let's do it.
Preferably not right now. I mean,
and right, okay,
In 45 minutes.
To Derek's point,
or tonight, at 5:59, or what time do we end today? At 5 o'clock, so 5:01. Feel free.
Okay, at 5:01, please go to the website.
Eastern.
In the meantime, I'll take you there on a journey. Can you just confirm, Derek and Sue and Wendy, that we're now looking at the website?
We are.
Yes.
Okay. So outcomesnce.org is a website, again, fully built with no budget or project management, or for that matter, technical skill. But it serves the purpose, we hope. And what you'll find in the upper menu is the homepage, which allows you to navigate to the glossary of terms, to dig back into the vision, background, and methods that Sue has just walked you through, so you get an understanding of why we're so committed to this credible, rigorous, and transparent process. You'll also find a Contact Us page, and through that Contact Us page, we can collect information. Again, each of us is trying to separate this from our day job. So over the last 10 months, we've tried to separate my inbox being filled with OSP questions. And so we've set up a separate website, and we've set up a separate email address. So if you have any specific comments about it, you can use this contact form to communicate with the members of the steering team. We have the About Us page, again, just providing full transparency of whose voice has lent itself to improve this glossary and to create the first version 1 of the glossary, and that includes the steering team members, as long as all those contributing through the interviews, focus groups, or call for comments, with the recognition that in many cases, one individual is speaking on behalf of their organization, and especially for the call for comments, there may have been one individual's name on that call for comments response, but we've now learned that organizations had 2 or 3 hour workshops internally to make sure that they fully understood it, and there really may have been another 2 to 3 dozen folks who have contributed. But I think what most people are going to be most interested is, and we'll save the best for last, but there's a blog here. You can come in and you can subscribe to the blog. We're going to continue to communicate where we are in the process. Again, we'll use Twitter and LinkedIn as we have for the last 10 months. If people have been aware of those channels, there's Outcomes in CE is our Twitter account, and we've been communicating through the CME group in LinkedIn to keep the word out to, I think the CME group now, we have nearly 10,000 members of that group. And so we'll continue to use those channels, but also use the OSP blog. And last, but certainly not least, is the glossary itself. The vision for the website and the vision for the initial launch is one of a Wikipedia, if you will. And in the last half of our presentation today, we'll kind of talk about how people are employing or beginning to employ or imagining how they're going to employ the glossary. But as a single source of truth, we're using the Outcome Standardization glossary webpage, which you certainly can bookmark at outcomesince.org/glossary. From this, right now are the 25 terms in the initial version. Each one of these is linked out to its separate page. So if we want to learn more about the participation funnel, if we want to learn more about what a participant is and why we're never going to use that term, hopefully after today, and you can download the glossary by entering your first name, last name, and email address, and that'll take you to a page where you can download a PDF of the glossary V1. And so with that little tour, I should be able to navigate back over to the slide deck and then hand it off to Wendy to kind of moderate us through an initial look at some of the more popularly discussed terms over the last few months.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for joining today. So as Brian said, we're just going to focus on a few today. You've seen where you could obtain the full glossary. And we'll start out, as Brian said, this is the most discussed, the most heated discussions were really around Moore's Level 1, so participation. Many organizations, many individuals were counting different terms differently. So I was saying participant and somebody else was calling the same thing learner, for example. And there are hundreds of examples like that. But we'll start here with what we're stating in the glossary. As far as participation, big picture, learner funnel. So learner funnel, if you can imagine, it's, it might start with the reach of the potential people that you're targeting or that you're, sending invitations to for your program. And it goes down, smaller and smaller as you get to actual folks that are in your educational experience itself. Folks that have taken the pretest come first. Folks that have been exposed to CME front matter, if you have that. And the funnel gets smaller and smaller until you get to completers and folks that actually get CME certificates for CME programs. So the funnel is going to look different for everyone. If you are an organization that puts on a lot of live meetings, your funnel is going to look completely different to an organization that focuses really on online education. And also, you're going to be able to count different things based on your level of technology and whether you're live versus online. So these terms really are going to have to be applied and interpreted differently based on your educational, modality, how you're delivering your education. But learner funnel is basically the big picture of steps. And we'll move to the next slide into a participant. So Brian already teased this. So this is such a loaded term, and everyone we spoke to in the interviews, the focus groups, and all the call for comments, really reiterated that there's such confusion around the term participant that as a committee, we have decided not to use the term anymore. There's too much misinformation and misinterpretation. So we're proposing, and it's been accepted, through the call for comments and everyone we've spoken to, that it'll just be easier to avoid this term. You could talk about in general participation, but when you're in doing your reporting, when you're entering terms into your reporting and counting individuals that went through your participation funnel, let's move on to other terms. So we've got many of them. There are terms such as, starter, completer, learner. We're going to focus on learner here on the next slide. So this is a term to describe a professional that is going through your educational funnel and is actually exposed to the CME, to the educational content itself. So in a live program, that would be, listening to a live speaker panel, whatever your approach is. For an online program, this would be actually entering into the part of the education where they're learning about the topic of interest. So a learner is not someone that just sees the CME front matter. A learner is not somebody that takes your pretest. We have different terms for that. So this is someone that's moved past those steps, if you have those steps in your process, and is being educated by the content itself. So I'll speak for myself first, and then I'm going to want to hear from Sue and Brian, and obviously take any questions if they've come about these terms. But I work at a medical education company, and in our experience, we were using the term participant for someone that was actually exposed to the educational content. And I know from speaking to colleagues at different, from different organizations, whether they're MACs or academics, or from medical societies, that some of them are using that term, some of them were calling folks learners, and people generally appreciate that at least we're getting on the same page. So for my organization, this is definitely going to be a shift where we have to change terms, but in the big picture, I appreciate it because I want to be on the same page of my colleagues from different organizations. And it's nice not to have to do so much explaining about what I mean by terms in my reports, because I handle outcomes reporting myself. So Brian and Sue, what's been the reaction that you've heard in your organizations and colleagues outside of your organization for these new terms?
Go ahead, Sue.
So I would say, so at AstraZeneca, we're actually in a neat little place where we've actually hired new people that are new to medical education, and we're also revamping our grants portal. So I haven't necessarily introduced all these topics to the team because I want to see what terms they already know and try not to teach them the bad words and teach them, the right definitions. So I am slightly behind where other people are. I pledge right now to everyone on CME Palooza that I will not use the word participant moving forward. Yes, those conversations were humbling and they were embarrassing, and I never want to revisit that. But I look forward to actually educating the team on these terms and why it's so very important that we do follow these terms. But I have heard from a few companies that have shared with me that, hey, we've seen this, we participated in the call for comments, and we're getting on board, and we're seeing what we need to do with our learning management system, how we need to update that in order to move forward. So I'm very excited because there's good momentum.
Are there any barriers that you might foresee to adapting these new terms among your colleagues?
Yeah, I would, because I think, we only change if we have to change. And so I think some people will be like, well, if I'm not really reporting, depending on what their teams want to hear, if they're okay just reporting exposures or, participation, I think it's more around like what their teams want to hear. And I think it's just with everything, it's just learning new semantics. And I think what's important to us is having this glossary, and sometimes to our teammates who are come at things at more a medical perspective, some of those nuances may not, they may not see the nuances the way that we do. They may not appreciate them. So I think it's going to be more team by team and what's the best way to communicate. And if we are still communicating with teams on higher levels, some of these terms may not really have a huge impact.
Brian?
Yeah. First of all, let me thank Jill Erickson, LB Wong, Aileen Cantelmi, John Junkowitz, Debbie Schwartz, Antonio Mayo, who've already subscribed to the website in the last 30 seconds. Let's keep the ball right. It's got a little Jerry Lewis vibe there, didn't I? Woo! Drum roll,
That's
please.
right.
All right. So early on in the process, I think some of the concern, and again, why we stayed rigorous, credible, and transparent, is that individuals, see if I can be as diplomatic about this as possible. There are certainly instances where the vagueness of these terms was beneficial to some organizations. And so being able to say that we had 10,000 participants when what they were really describing was not even unique, but total clicks on a website. People felt better about the numbers. And often what ended up happening is you'd get down to the end of the funnel and the funnel would look bad. And if folks dug in deeper and deeper and deeper, it tended to create disappointments, or there was a miscommunication between providers and supporters, because at one point I would hear a high number. Again, as a supporter at Wyeth and Pfizer and Cephalon, I've struggled with this now for more than 15 years. And some of that resurfaced during the interviews and during the focus groups. There were certainly providers who had concern that the way they've always used the term versus the way the consensus has kind of applied to the term. Thank you, Jessica Epps, for also joining the website. The way the terms applied in their organization may lower their numbers, and they had an initial concern. And I think that's something that we recognize, that there could be a little bit of that going on, but in the larger good of the community, from the research perspective, from the provider and supporters perspective, I feel like everybody in their professional identity recognized that this was important. What was interesting was a few supporters said similar things, is that they've now been going to their internal teams. Maria had just mentioned on the previous session here that she does quarterly, I think at BMS, they do quarterly infographics. Well, if last quarter you showed an infographic to your medical directors and said last quarter we educated 10,000 learners, and really what those numbers were participant numbers. And now this quarter, you're saying we educated 3,000 learners, that there's a little bit of concern there. I think LB mentioned the same thing in her interview. So we understand there could be a little bit of that concern that's surfacing over the next few months. But I don't think anybody we talk through amongst the steering team or the one-on-one interviews or the focus groups can't imagine what the world's going to be like 6 months from now. And this idea that 4 months or 6 months from now, we may have a different baseline, but we now have a baseline that is firmly grounded, from which we can do much more interesting things. And so as you look at the list of terms, Sue had mentioned that we started with 80. At one point through iteration, we had well over 100 proposed terms that the steering team and the steering team's kind of web of influence brought back and said, this is something I know we struggle with. Over 100. What we did is we broke those terms down. The steering team subdivided, and everyone said, give me these 15 and 20, or give me these 25, and we'll all come up with an initial proposal. And that work alone, delegating from 100 plus down to the individuals 20 or 25, each of us was taking, just for that one step in phase one, each of us was taking 8 to 10 hours to go through and try to provide that rigor behind it. And it's from that initial experience that we said, we got to go far simpler. If the community is going to embrace this, then it has to be something that's digestible for them. And so we narrowed in on these first 24 or 25 terms just to set a foundation, keeping in mind that right after AIS this year, the steering team's going to regroup, go back to our original list, and try to identify what the next 10 or 15 are. And let me take a breath right now and do a shout out. Since I started talking, another 15 people have subscribed to the website and begun downloading the glossary. So Wendy, given all of that background around these terms, learner, participant, and Derek, let us know if we got any questions coming.
We do, but you have to stop talking so I can give them. Keep talking. I was just kidding. But I do have a couple questions when you're done.
Go for it. No, you're good.
Okay. Are you ready for the questions? There's
yes,
a couple.
please.
There's one specifically for Wendy, so I'll give that one first. Okay. It's a clarifying question. So,
Sure.
question for Wendy. Can you please clarify if someone engages with content, for example, with an online activity, but they do not do the pretest, are they considered a learner?
Yes.
Okay, that was easy.
Derek,
I think they're all discreet, and tell me if anyone on the panel disagrees that you don't have to participate in an earlier part of the funnel to be counted in a later part, but it depends on your technology. In some technologies, you could perhaps opt out or skip a pretest. In some, you're forced to take a pretest. So that would make sense, but you'd still be a learner.
Yeah, and so Derek, the idea is, and another theme of the steering team conversations is we in no way are ascribing value to any of these terms. We are not saying that a learner is more important than a completer, is more important than a credit requester. Each organization can figure out what they think is the important thing to measure and report on, and each supporter can clearly say, we feel like we want learners and completers. But other organizations have said, John, before I left Genentech, now I think he's at Daiichi, he's clearly said a completer isn't that important. If a learner shows up, if a healthcare professional shows up and they access the content and they don't complete it, but they got what they needed,
Right.
then CME has done what it was supposed to do. That activity has done for that learner what it's supposed to do. So no value is being ascribed to any of these terms. And that the follow-on part is with learner, the great conversation around the learning educational value of a pretest, even of front matter, if you will, and how a learner begins to look at that and understand what the content is and understand how it relates to them, and they understand the importance of it, and they're going through that self-assessment. It's impossible to say that learning never happens in front matter or in a pretest, especially if that pretest has some kind of feedback applied to it. Similarly, on the post test, if someone gets a question wrong and there's feedback provided, it's absolutely logical to say learning happens in the post test. But through all the conversations, we had to draw a line someplace to standardize the definition. And so a learner is someone who gets to and starts the educational content. A completer is someone who gets through all of the educational content that was designed for that activity. Is one more important than the other? No, but if we're using the right terms, then LB and Jill and Maria and Sue, when they say in some outcomes reporting or in a letter of agreement, then we'd like you to report back on learners and completers, then everybody knows that those exactly what those individuals mean.
I have more questions. You want me to keep going?
Sure.
Okay. How would you describe the proposed number of learners for a print publication?
Proposed number of learners, that's fine. You think that there's going to be 1,000 people that are going to read that publication. It's proposed. That word is the important word. Now, is there any way to credibly report on learners for a print publication? Not that any of us on the steering team or in the focus groups could figure out. So you can't. Again, we're not ascribing value to reporting on a learner in that format or that intervention. You can't, but you can maybe if you're distributing it through an online system or you're mailing it out, then you can be very precise with what you do report, that the monograph was mailed out to 5,000 people. And you may be able to be very precise in the fact that of that set of people, that 200 people requested credit. That's what you can measure. That's fine. That's what you can measure. That's what you should measure. And using any of these other terms that you can't credibly assign into your funnel, you should just avoid.
Okay. I have
So
one
when-
specifically for Sue, unless someone else wants to respond.
No, I think that was good.
Okay. Actually, Brian, someone wanted you to put up the website address again, if you can do that.
I can do outcomesnce.org.
Okay. So Sue, I assume this is for you, but I guess anyone can answer it. I'd be interested to know which part of the learner funnel is of most interest to supporters. Starts, learners, completions. We often enter cost learner in grant systems, yet with these new definitions, a learner may have simply taken the pretest and closed the activity, never accessing the content.
Can I say all of them?
Sure, you can say
Okay,
whatever you
that would
want.
be no. I think so. For me, it goes back to like Wendy had said. It really depends on what your activity is, right? And I think it's what you're trying to achieve. And for me, I like to know how the learner is engaging with the activity. So I do appreciate all parts of the funnel because I think if the education is really relevant and is giving what the learner needs, for a certain learner, they may go through all the way, learner to, start, learner to completer, right? So I don't think there's one metric. I think that if I look at an activity and if I see a lot of learners and very few completers, then I would want someone to clarify that for me. But I think it really it tells a story of how people are interacting with the activity.
Yeah, there seems to be kind of this, we heard it multiple times, this idea that the goal of the provider is to get as many numbers as they possibly can. And in many ways, they almost, it's like a fixed mindset that, we don't want to put a pretest before the activity because people are going to drop off. And, we want, if there's 2 clicks, or we want to allow the learners to scrub all the way through the education, because if they're gated in some way, there's going to be a fall off. There's going to be a fall off, right? It's absolutely natural that a learner may get 10 minutes into an educational activity and decide to skip to the last 5 minutes of the educational activity. And understanding that, I guess the more powerful the microscope is, the better for everybody. But understanding where there are fall offs, and then each organization should be able to benchmark their participation funnel. If you're running satellite symposia, you're probably only going to be able to measure 2 or 3 things. If you're doing online education, may be able to measure 15 or 20. But when you're using standardized measures across each of those different formats, you now have this kind of growing library of data. And so if your starts to completers, there's a significant fall off there, then that, as Sue suggests, that's hinting at the educational intervention itself. If there's a fall off between front matter viewers and pretest starters, then maybe there's something in the technology that's gating the learners. Again, the more precise we can be from a research scientist, the better. The question is about the supporters. I think Sue would say all. In the other conversations we've had, there's certainly supporters who said fundamentally it's about learners. Yep. And others have said fundamentally it's about completers, and others have said fundamentally it's about credit requesters. I don't know that we're going to be able to standardize everyone's belief in what should be reported, at least not yet. It's just standardizing the way we go about the reporting for now.
I would actually like to see, though, if we can get in the next 6 months to a year, get really good benchmark data for different formats. And maybe it's by organization. And then we have an idea of, okay, because my question is always like, all right, this is what I'm seeing for this one activity. Tell me what you've seen with other activities in previous years on this topic so I can see how the education is performing. So it would be great if we had benchmarking. Yeah. I think to go back to my original response, I do have a very silly statement that I use that I'll say, across the, let's just say 1 million grants that we have supported, there are 5 million activities that will, and I was using the word exposed, let's just say 100,000 healthcare professionals who manage patients in a certain area, certain condition. So I was using that statement just to kind of give some kind of idea of what we've done, but it's not very specific, doesn't give us any kind of educational real information, right? Doesn't say how anyone's interacting with the education. It's just, this is what we've done. This is what we supported. Don't laugh, Brian.
Not laughing.
I have one more question if you want me. I don't want to take time from your presentation, though. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah,
I
go
think
away.
we're good.
Okay,
Yeah,
one more. I forgot to mention the last couple questions came through our ASIM text line. Feel free to use it. This one came in through a tweet. To encourage consistency in the industry, would it be a good idea to include these definitions in LOAs and/or contracts with partners?
That again, that is, it's a
Company by company.
company by company. I have spoken in the last week with more than a half dozen supporters, remembering that's only one of the lenses, right? One of the stakeholders that benefits from this is the supporters. But I've talked with about a half dozen, not including those who are on the steering team. And in many cases, the expectation is at least on the grants team's website or on the grant management page, the splash page in the grant management system, that there would be some messaging around the OSP glossary with a link to the website, basically saying, we endorse what this project and the glossary are doing. And what's not on the website now, but hopefully will be in the next 2 to 3 weeks, is I have more than a dozen folks who have said they're either intending to publicly endorse with a company logo. And so the OSP, the outcomesnce.org website will have an endorsements page. And so any organization, society, provider, supporter who is committed to this effort, this ongoing research effort, will have the ability to put some testimonials and their logos up there, simply saying, this is what we're doing. But we also, Anthea is championing an effort with supporters to dig into their grant management systems. So we've kind of mapped each of the supporters in their grant management system. So the idea is to, when the time's right, if the community does believe that what we've done over the last 11 months there's value in it, we're hoping that there is. I mean, I've said this to Wendy and Sue, there is a very good chance that people are going to laugh us off the stage today and say this was all a waste of time. It doesn't look like it because we had another 15 people just subscribe to the website. But the hope is that potentially we could somehow work with the grant management systems to figure out a way to employ these terms, and whether that's some other technological way of XML or something. I think that's probably a 2020 effort, hopefully. But I saw, someone had asked the question, Derek, around the steering team composition.
Yes. They were just curious as to how it was determined who would be on that steering team.
So it was in essence, 6 of us were all of us, I think, were in the room at AIS last year. In the hallway conversation that immediately followed me making a pledge to try to solve this, the steering team started taking shape. So it was folks who, agreed with what Greg and Karen and Mike and Anne-Marie had all brought to the table. And so Jason and Greg and Wendy and Thea and Karen were on board. And then about 2.5, 3 months after we found it, maybe about 2 months, Sue, I think it's about 2 months after we started this, the SIG, the Special Interest Group for IACE, the IACE SIG, they've been working on a broader project around the language we use to tell our story. Many people, I think, participated in their survey at the end of the year and a poster that was presented. And so at that point, there was the recognition that maybe if we had a liaison who was participating in the SIG, who also had an interest in participating in the outcome standardization project. And so Sue was asked and agreed to kind of serve as the bridging both of those simultaneous projects that were going on. So in the interviews and focus groups that followed, there at least a dozen times I said, there is to an individual. I said this to Katie Robinson. I said this to certain like Riaz at times. There, Katie Doyle, and a number of others. And it was like, you have every bit of the you should have been on the steering team. And so what we're thinking about doing, since they weren't in the beginning because they just weren't in the hallway at that time and didn't commit on the spot after my browbeating to join the steering team, our thought moving forward is that we'll kind of rotate through. So maybe one or two people will step down each year and a few people will step in each year, trying to not make the steering team too large, knowing that there's still so many other ways that people can volunteer and their voices can be heard. Being on the steering team at this point is nothing but legwork, really, because the community is the one who's guiding which terms we follow. And so starting in June, we'll start with another set of interviews, another set of focus groups, another call for comments. And so the next, whether it's 10 or 15 or 20 terms, will make its way through the sausage factory to be presented hopefully at next year's annual Alliance meeting. Anything else, Derek? Any other questions coming in?
The only other question was just a fairly general question about what's been the biggest challenge that you've faced with this project?
So far, since phase 1 through 4 has been grinding through the definitions, is I think just the amount of sheer work that's gone into it. Again, hundreds and hundreds of hours. But also the recognition that in many cases, as you'll see when you go to the website, Amy and Tristan and Heather and Katie and Karen and Neha and Mike and Scott and Cindy and Greg and Jennifer, who just subscribed, as you go to the website, you'll realize that there's still maybe a half dozen or more of the terms, the evidence behind them is consensus opinion, because there was no evidence around how the term should be used. And there's still quite a few, maybe there's 3 or 4 terms where the examples currently say, please share your examples. Moving it from a PDF document to it living on the website allows us to provide much more. It is every bit the intention that as people share examples, we will be cross-linking out to people's examples. If you've got a great evaluation form that you've used and had success with, well, let's link to best practice evaluation forms that people have shown. Especially when we move from just basic terms to really approaches and best practices, what is the best way to ask a commitment to change question? What is the value? What is the evidence behind commitment to change or intent to change? None of us are experts about it. Many of us have tried different approaches. None of it's been compared in a rigorous trial of any way. So it's impossible for Wendy to tell me that my approach is wrong or for Sue to say Wendy's approach is wrong. There is no right or wrong right now for probably 80% of the stuff that we've been working through. Wendy, Sue, any other thoughts on biggest challenge?
I'll interrupt real quick. Yeah, we have about 2 minutes left, and then I will need to wrap things up. So.
No, I think a lot of it was just getting past the learner funnel, which I love. Conceptually, I love it. And then participant, exposure, reach, like those basic terms that we use, like once we got past those, and those were a lot of discussion, it was interesting. But once we got past that, then I think things really started to move. But that was, the Moore's level 1 and some of those basic terms. Mm-hmm. I think that was the hardest thing for me.
Yeah. I think overall the industry is so hungry to get on the same page and just be clear and transparent about what we mean when we say different things, that there's less resistance than maybe we anticipated.
Yep.
Knock on wood. So between now and AIS, so the idea we're presenting, other members of the steering team are presenting at AIS, and the idea there is basically not only to repeat most of this presentation, but also do a 1-month retrospective. What have people done since from April 17th to I think that's May 5th or May 6th, and try to dig into what's already been learned and what other barriers have now been identified.
So should people use the Contact Us form to maybe share stories?
Please, absolutely, and
then that
we'll
could
be doing we'll reach out to those that have many of those who have subscribed and said, "What's your first 3 or 4 week experience with this glossary? Technically, does it work? Does the wiki model work? Do any other ideas on how to support the employment of it is totally on the table now. We're open to anything."
All right. Great.
Thanks everyone for your interest in the project.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for all their questions. That was really great. And thanks to 3 of you for an excellent overview. Let me just wrap up real quick here. If all of you who are watching would please at some point today take our survey. It's very simple. Just click on the survey link, which is on the live page. And there's only about 7 questions. It literally would take you like 30 seconds to complete. So we do use that a lot for our planning for the next Paloozas, etc. And lastly, to view the next session, which the next session is a special 5-year anniversary session on the Mech Reborn, our present and future. We did a session on the death of the Mech 5 years ago during one of our first CME Paloozas. So this is apparently it's not dead. Big surprise. I'm sure Wendy's glad to hear that. So all you have to do is just refresh the screen at the top of the hour. Scott will have the link up for the new video, and you can keep watching. So with that, thanks everyone,
Thanks, Derek.
and we will talk to you all later.